These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, thinking about Black internationalism through Pauulu's diaspora with Quito Swan. Africa World Now Project is next. As we have explored in previous programs, in fact, as we have attempted to unpack in every program, Black internationalism is an intentional disruption, a radical intervention in the global terms of order. In order to understand Black internationalism as a critical disruption, a radical intervention, we must unpack it. The concept international, as understood in dominant discourse, as opposed to discourses on the periphery, discourses from below, is related to the creation and forced imposition of the nation state, birthed from a European historiography and historicity as the dominant mechanism that organizes human life. The imposition of mechanisms such as colonialism and chattel slavery, for instance, rooted in a specific epistemology, was necessary to structure institutions and ways of knowing that reconceptualized what it means to be human as the justification for and maintenance of the idea of private property. Being so, international indicates a relationship at various levels of communities of people across artificial boundaries. It is from here Black internationalism then is understood as a radical disruption of these systems and institutions. It is a critical intervention in ways of knowing. What must not be lost in this praxis is the fact that this radical disruption is simultaneously a clear articulation and theorization of Black power. Cedric Robinson asserts, if we are to survive, we must take nothing which is dead and choose wisely among the dying. This assertion is certainly true on many levels, but requires a simultaneously developed alternative foundation to build upon, as the wise choices must be planted into something. Today, we explore the ideas and arguments in Pauulu's diaspora, Black internationalism and environmental justice as presented by Quito Swan. Properly situated, we can see Pauulu's diaspora, Black internationalism and environmental justice presents a framework for that alternative, the possibilities of inventing the future. Pauulu's diaspora is a mapping of Black internationalism across the Atlantic, Indian, and Oceanic worlds through the life and work of 20th century radical Pauulu Kamarakafego. In this work, Dr. Quito Swan is disrupting and challenging limited conceptualizations and understanding of Black power by situating it properly in an international context, a Black international context. Dr. Swan offers us a map on how Pauulu was following in the long tradition of those who came before, a genealogy of Black internationalism's praxis of resistance. Quito Swan is a professor of Africana Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where he directs the William Monroe Trotter Institute for the Study of Black Culture. He is a historian of Black internationalism, global Black power, and the Black Pacific. Dr. Swan is author of many articles as well as The Struggle for Decolonization, Black Power, and Bermuda. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land, for the benefit of all people. Enjoy the program. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Quito Swan. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing great, James. Thanks for having me.
Oh man, no problem, man. And as you know, we've talked over the years about your work and shared ideas and had plenty of conversation as being connected to Howard and through other things that we have done. This work, as we talked about a little bit offline, this work has been in a long time making, but it's also connected to a lot of the other work, but also to a grander scheme or to a grand strategy that I think that is going on, particularly in your mind, but also in your practice, right, in your scholarship. And before we kind of get to that particular grand strategy, is that let's set this term of engagement today, and let's talk about this work in connection with your first work. And your first work, and of course we're talking about your current work, Pauulu's Diaspora, but also this is connected to your first work, Black Power in Bermuda, the Struggle for Decolonization. And I think this is an important and essential practice to always map our genealogies, map our histories, because a lot of people may take, certain points or certain ideas and think that they just discovered Quito Swan's work, right? Just discovered, Pauulu's Diaspora, and they say, oh, we just discovered, Dr. Quito Swan, he's a newcomer to this. But no, Dr. Quito Swan has been thinking about this for a long particular time. And I think it's important to map a genealogy, right? So, and just to give a little teaser of this grand scheme or this grand strategy is that, what you're doing is situating, an academic field, this idea of a Black Power studies or Black internationalism, and you're really moving it through the African diaspora, Pan-Africanism, decolonization, and really situating it back into its proper context. And what I would say is this context is a praxis of resistance. Could you talk a little bit about the origins of this current work being birthed not only in your own personal interactions with the subject of this current work, but also the ideas that you are literally kind of mapping out in your first work? And again, before I read it, your first work is the Black Power in Bermuda, the Struggle for Decolonization, and it will move into this current work. Could you talk a little bit about how that first work set the terms of engagement for this work?
James, that's a great intro, and I definitely want to hear about this master structure that you see, right? Because you're absolutely correct. The book is positioned. It also is positioned for the next project that is part of another growth, but also some of it is return to the source. The next project, which will come out this year as well, is titled Pacifica Black, and it's about Oceania and the Black International, and which looks at Pacific liberation struggles and Black internationalism more broadly. As Pauulu's Diaspora is centered on a Black Power Pan-Africanist ecological engineer from Bermuda who travels the world in different hats and connects the global South to revolutionary struggle and a practice of what I would say ecological decolonization. But yeah, Pauulu is a really important figure in Bermuda's Black Power movement. He calls the first International Black Power Conference of Bermuda in 1969, which is, I do talk about that a lot in the first book. As I talked about on your show, the British, Canadian, US governments try to suppress that conference. Pauulu, in the process, becomes really endeared to the Black youth of the island, specifically a group called the Black Parade Cadre. And so I talk about Pauulu in the context of Black Power in Bermuda, and I kind of leave off this moment where he is invited to Australia by a group, the Aborigines Advancement League, who they're building their own Black Power movement. and it's pretty much asked to come give some insight. And so in many ways, Pauulu's diaspora jumps off from that moment. But at the same time, it jumps back too. Because Pauulu's work in Bermuda, by the time as a Black Power activist in the 1950s or early 60s, he was involved in Bermuda struggle for, decolonization and also voting rights and universal adult suffrage, which, voting practices in Bermuda were highly racist. Bermuda's Black majority was disenfranchised. And he was also involved in some of these early efforts to, he helps he's the father of universal adult suffrage in Bermuda. But I encounter him, I engage him as a Black Power activist. But when I meet Pauulu, physically, it's, mid-90s. I'm coming out of FAMU, big up to Florida A&M University, Rattler for life. And, I'm at the time, I'm saying me, but I'm talking about a generation. We're trying to find our way, right? Some of us are looking at Rasta's Avenue, some is the Afrocentric movement, some is Nation of Islam, some, Communist Party or versions of Black Marxism. We're trying to find our way. For some, it's capoeira, or for some, it's African dance companies. We're trying to find our way as young people. And so in the part of that process, we're reading a broad range of books. So, I'm in Bermuda, fresh out of college, reading Rasta and Resistance. Walter Rodney's Groundlings is really important. And I meet Pauulu. I'm reading Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James. I meet Pauulu. I'm invited to the house of a Black Power activist, former Black Power activist, her name was Michelle Caldoun. And she says, I need you to meet somebody. And I meet this brother who's, the quietest person in the room, but he knows everybody in the books I'm reading on a first-name basis. He knows Rodney. He wrote with James for decades. James is his mentor. He's traveled the world. He's traveled to East Africa, West Africa. He's traveled to the Pacific, and he can talk about Black people in the Pacific. For me, this is something I'm seeing in a Renuka Rashidi lecture about Aborigines in Australia. Pauulu is someone who's traveled these places for decades. He knows Yofa Minyakanen, and he just becomes this fountain of information about the Black world, Bermuda's local struggles. And I'm sitting there, decided to go back to grad school. I want to study the African diaspora at a Black institution. At the time, Howard University had the only PhD program, African diaspora studies. But I didn't know what I was going to do. There was going to be Garvey in Bermuda or the Black Power movement. Pauulu has me driving him around the island, doing political work, doing things that we're not interested in doing. I mean, I'm just taking this brother around wherever he wants to go, but his feeding of information, so I love it. Well, on a hill one day, he said, stop the car. He said, you see that building over the hill? He points to this building, like that we can only see because on top of this big hill. He said, that used to be where the UNIA had one of its bakeries. And that moment was when I said, you know what? I'm going to study the UNIA in Bermuda as my master's thesis, and I'll do Black Power in Bermuda as my dissertation. So Pauulu, in a very direct way, actually directed me towards my work as a graduate student. At the time, if you had asked me, was I going to write a book about Pauulu, I would have said, there's no way I could even take on something so grand. My view was very myopic. In hindsight, I didn't even know the value of what I was doing. I was trying to tell a local story to inspire a local community to fight for Black liberation in our community. That was the scope of my thinking. Pauulu radically changes that. So to answer the question in a long-winded way, Pauulu was there academically as well as politically and socially in terms of my development as a Black scholar trying to do work that matters for Black communities.
And for me, that's part of that grand strategy of rescuing what has come to be termed in many academic circles this notion of Black power studies, but also really unpacking this notion of Black internationalism, because this is an area that I look at consistently. This is an area that I, as you know, we talk about this. We've talked about this over the years. The last conversation that we had when we were passing each other was really actually about the Bandung conference, right?
Yes,
you know, because I was trying to move that into some of the work that I was doing, you know, at the time, and that was a few years ago. And again, we were able to catch up before now, and you know, and understand that we face similar types of challenges. But part of that grand strategy is really kind of unpacking this notion of Black internationalism, because it's in vogue, and we have to be clear about, you know, folk who are studying, but also folk who are studying for use in liberation practices, right? You know, so to me, what you're doing is trying to really unpack and break away this notion that has really moved into academic circles, and really talk in circles, right? This notion of Black power. And so I guess I had to go straight to the grand strategy, what I see that you're doing. But this goes important, because this goes into, you led right to my next idea, my question that popped out to me as I was looking through, reading through your work. You're making a few arguments in your current work, right? But one of the important that I think is particularly interesting is what you're doing is really mapping this idea of Black power through praxis, right? Through Pauulu, right? And what you just explained to me is how those ideas take root and then move out through the different forms throughout the diaspora, right? Could you talk a little bit about the relationships that Pauulu shared with you, and how it developed his intellectual and political activity, and how that filtered into yourself, right? Filtered into you becoming an academic, but also a person who is really centered on a critical consciousness, a critical pedagogy, that you're not just teaching just to teach, or you're not just writing just to write. Could you talk a little bit about some of the relationships, for example, CLR James, for example, you know, the UNIA. Could you talk a little bit about how that was very important, not only for Pauulu, right, but also how that filtered itself, because you're mapping an idea through a praxis. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you know, great question, great comment. So Pauulu meets CLR James as a really young person in Bermuda. It's these are stories, right? These are stories, and when you listen to the stories beyond the academic frameworks, it's really about how people relate to people. And so my practice becomes about building relationships than just what's on paper. Because it's the relationships that actually create the stories. So, and what I mean by that is, and that lead us to the political stories, right? That we're going to talk about, but they're based upon how people actually live their lives. So Pauulu's family, his father's from St. Kitts, his mother's from Nevis. So he comes from small islands, but in Bermuda context of big islands. His family migrates to Bermuda in a period of West Indian migration around the turn of the 20th century. And what I was trying to do in the book, which was, you know, a little maybe overly ambitious, but that's the type of scholarship that I want to focus on. I want to take risks. Was that each chapter will give us something about the diaspora world. And if folks only read one chapter, they get something transformative and some type of tool to look at the Black world differently. So what I was trying to demonstrate in the first chapter was Pauulu's story was not just about him as this big man. That's not how he lived his life. So I tried to write about the communities he was connected with and put him in a conversation, put the communities in conversation through him, showing that the Black world's connected in all these phenomenal ways that are sometimes not even intentional. Academics want to create frameworks that's, in my opinion, are very intentional all the time. But that's not how life is. Everything's not intentional. Everything doesn't add up, right? It makes sense in the long run, but in the moment, sometimes things don't make sense. So usually when we think about West Indians traveling around the turn of the century, in our minds, they're going to the Panama Canal, Costa Rica, which are all true, right? They're going to London, check. They're going to Paris, check. They're ending up in Harlem. All of this is true. But we also have West Indians, and by West Indians, that's also a note for other diaspora communities that could be within the United States too. They're going to other small spaces. But the routes to get to those small spaces, I call them the mobile metropoles. They're temporary, but the train ride becomes a space of transformation. The boat rides, sometimes to small cities. So while we should look at Chicago and the rise of Black music in Harlem, African American communities from small communities are going a lot of places. Florida, for example. So the point was, if we can study migration in small communities, using Bermuda as an example, we can take this model to other similar communities across the Black world. Long story short is this. Pauulu's parents come to Bermuda, turn of the 20th century. He's in raised in Bermuda, born in Bermuda, raised in Bermuda, a very West Indian-centered community. It's a household of cassava. It's a household of ackee and saltfish. It's a household of Bermuda's, peas and rice, and the Southern Caribbean's rice and peas. It's all of that. It's ackee and saltfish, it's codfish and potatoes. It's just amazing world that Bermuda has of Black Caribbean cultures. That's culturally speaking, but also in a political context, Bermuda is also very segregated. So when West Indians or when Black people travel to Bermuda, they cannot stay in white hotels. So they have to stay with other communities. C.L.R. James comes to Bermuda in the 1930s. He can't stay in a white hotel. He ends up staying at Pauulu's home. So, and this hits off the friendship. Pauulu ends up as a student at NYU, and he goes to C.L.R. James' talk at Abyssinian Baptist Church. And this now the personal relationship also now becomes political, and James becomes a mentor for Pauulu for pretty much the rest of his life. He cooks for James over the years. James invites him to Trinidad as a bodyguard, do letters. James opens the 69 Black Power Conference. But these are also due to the relationships. Now, what's important about this for me is Pauulu would never define himself as a Marxist. He has a very strong socialist, Black socialist, African socialist view of the world, but he never defined himself as a Marxist. And in fact, he had a lot of disdain for white Marxists who still express their racism. So in other words, James and Pauulu are rice and peas. James is, it's iconic, right? Black Marxist, Trotskyite, right? But yet for Pauulu, even though there's a moment where the politics don't align, the relationship is so strong. And so that, to me, that speaks to the reality of Black people. The relationship mattered more than the ideological thinking. There are clearly, politically, there were a ton of other intersections that they were aligned with. But the personal relationships that build also, for me now, allows me to talk about why James is important to the Black Power movement. Why James, on one hand, could have a critique of Kwame Ture, but at the same time, Black Jacobins is being read by Black Power activists without question, because James is more than just Marxist Trotskyite ideas. He's an actual living veteran activist who is making himself available to Black Power activists at the moment. And for Pauulu, that also gives Pauulu something else. So for me, that's a way of saying, similarly, that's how Pauulu would approach, my generation. I'll never forget the day I'm about to go to graduate school at Howard, and Pauulu invites me to his home. It's me and two friends of mine, and it's like 6 a.m. You know, I have a flight later that day. He said, you got to come over to the house. And first thing we do, we go outside. There's some cassava growing. And he says, see that cassava right there? You know, it can also be a weapon. It could be a poison if you did it like this, and boom, boom, boom. And we're talking about plants. Then he turns to me and he says, he looks him right in the eye and says, so you want to go study history? Like, what else are you going to take to Africa? Like, what other skill sets are you going to take? You're going to go to Africa and teach African history? He said, think about that. Like, you gotta have something else. You gotta think about, you need some praxis. You need something else. And whatever that else is, I don't know. But you should think about something else. And when you go to Howard, you have to like be the strongest. You gotta be as strong as possible. Otherwise, don't waste your time. If you're not gonna do something with the interest of being the best at it, don't even start it. And so that mattered to me. So the praxis part for me was something that I knew I had to try to engage in. And that's just the reality of the stories, right? This was who Pauulu was, right? He starts a conversation about political world by talking about a plant. But when we think of when Pauulu would tell us stories of how he connected the world, one of his first questions he asked communities that he traveled to was, what do y'all eat? It's like the first question he would ask. You know, not even the political dynamics, like, what do you eat? Where do you get your food? You know, and for him, it was like, once you have a sense of that question, it tells you a whole lot of other political things that are going on. And even for myself, when I would start my diaspora classes, I usually started around some discussion of African foods as a way of unifying, you know, my classroom around certain foods that we all would eat. So the point is, Pauulu's praxis has informed my work on so many levels. I appreciate the opportunity to even think through. Some of these things aren't really that conscious. They just become, you know, but there's a process. Like you said, you know, knowing this work right now, it's a process that got me to this point that I wasn't always able to even understand my master plan, quote unquote.
Grand strategy, your grand strategy.
My grand strategy, thank you. Yes, better phrasing. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. But that goes into, because what we're really talking about in the context of not only being able to formulate or articulate ideas, or map or trace ideas that folk read about in certain instances, whether they're institutionally connected or not. At the center of this and at the center of this is relationships, and how how these relationships really birth ways of understanding the world, which is something that's rooted in a Africanness, a very African return to the source. And of course, we have to look at the context of Cabral, Amilcar Cabral, and the work that he was doing, because the similarities are very, very important. Could you talk a little bit about that, the similarities, the relationships, the interactions, the you know, that notion of returning to the source, and how Pauulu understood that, but also he understood even more important is to transfer that to generational, transfer that to you, because you're reaching multiple young folk, right? You have taught thousands of, you know, your undergrad students. You've impacted graduate students, right? You know, relationships outside of the institution and inside of the institution, across institutions, across communities. So at the center of this, because you mentioned this notion of an African socialism, and how these notions of Marxism can move and move in and out of Black radicalism, it's because it's really about the relationship that African people have to not only the universe, but also to the earth itself, which, as you see, what we're moving to is what Pauulu's actual work, right? So could you talk a little bit about that, right? Talk a little bit about, pick one of those strands of thoughts and jump right in, Dr. Swan, jump right in. You know?
Well, I mean, it's phenomenal, because Pauulu meets Kwame Nkrumah.
Blues and antique blacks, astro
We are currently listening to a wide-ranging conversation where we are exploring Black internationalism through the praxis of Pauulu Kamarakafego, as presented by Dr. Quito Swan in his current work, Paulu's Diaspora, Black Internationalism and Environmental Justice. Quito Swan is professor of Africana Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where he directs the William Monroe Trotter Institute for the Study of Black Culture. He is a historian of Black internationalism, global Black power, and the Black Pacific. Dr. Swan is author of many articles as well as The Struggle for Decolonization, Black Power in Bermuda. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all people. Continue to enjoy the program.
It's fresh. I've known rivers, other bodies, making giant steps.
STLR James is home in London. And that's important because Pauulu is forced to leave NYU for denouncing, segregation. And before he leaves, he meets a teacher named Maddie Pegsy, who actually was a home economics icon in South Carolina, Orangeburg. She organized farm exhibitions and farm festivals. If you look her up, but this is what Pauulu does to you, right? He connects you in ways that you don't. He shows us how the Black world, because it's not him. He shows us how the Black world is connected through these unexpected ways because he's always seeking more. He's always seeking that Black radicalism. And in Paulu's diaspora, he's going to always end up at the most radicalized spaces of Black communities because that's just how he rolls. So he meets Maddie Pegsy. She says, well, you should come study at an HBCU. I'm at South Carolina State College. You should come there. So from NYU, he goes to South Carolina State College. This is before the Orangeburg Massacre. So this part of the book was talking about South Carolina's activism, in the 1950s, 1954, 55. But Pauulu only goes to South Carolina College because he has this relationship with somebody he meets in the library. So this is not intentional. But once he finds himself in South Carolina, he gets heavily involved in, this cross-section, resistance between the NAACP, Black sharecroppers, students at Claflin College and South Carolina State College, NAACP lawyers, who are fighting against these white citizen councils, who are burning crosses all across Orangeburg. Pauulu encourages students to arm themselves against Klan violence. He meets folks like Septima Clark. And this is one thing. This is 54, 55. The NAACP is outlawed. South Carolina branch is outlawed. Radical journalists like Majeska Simpkins is involved in this process, and so there's this network of support coming to this local struggle that's all across the United States. Actually, I found letters in crisis where there were some farmers in Ecuador who were sending support to this local struggle, in which students are kicked off campuses, in which reverends like Joseph Delaney shoots back at the Klan. Delaney is this amazing, revolutionary, reverend who says he's shot in the name of Jesus. He puts a Klan member in the hospital, flees to New York. He's outlawed in South Carolina. The governor has a warrant out for his arrest. He becomes a major figure in New York circles. But this is South Carolina. This is 1954, 1955. It's a ton of activism. Because of that, Pauulu was also kicked out of South Carolina State College. He ends up in California at Pasadena State College. He meets a ton of folks from the African continent who he plays cricket with, i.e. James, and he also drums with. And there's a core of Kenyan scholars, or Whoopi scholars, who he meets. So why does it all matter? Well, make a long story short, after his time in Pasadena, he wants to go to Liberia. He has to flee Liberia because he's involved in the labor strike. He runs to Ghana. he knows he can go to Nkrumah's home because he knows Nkrumah through James from London. Nkrumah, and also in Ghana, who was there, right? The Du Bois, Charlie Grin Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, that whole crew. Nkrumah says you should go to East Africa to help Kenya in its liberation struggle as about to be independent, which he does. Once he gets to Kenya, his introduction to Kenyan life are these students that he played drums with and played cricket with in California who introduced him to Kenya. So his story there's always these interpersonal relationships that lead his geographies that make things possible. Even his time going to Liberia is because his wife actually is part of William Tubman's family. So he's always using these relationships to find Black radicalism. And in Kenya, he starts to really do his work around environmentalism and building water tanks and bamboo. But it's the structure of that is this relationship that allows him to, exert his political views, which are always at the ground level, always.
Which is interesting, and let's piggyback on that point of really kind of laying the ground, particularly in Kenya. Let's pick up with that as a person who travels and takes students to Kenya consistently, who's built personal relationships with communities on the ground there. Myself, let's pick back up there in that particular, because again, we have to get out to the Pacific, right? We have to get into the Pacific areas as well. And we're not even halfway through this conversation yet, because this is very important, because when we're talking about mapping and when we talk about these histories, what you're doing, and it's something that I attempt to do as well, is how do we have a frame to look at this multiplicity, right? Because if you try to make sense of it, right? And that's the reason why, particularly, I have affinity with your work, and, followed you and looked at it over the years, and very excited about this one and also the next work that you're going to do, because it's also what you're doing is really mapping out a genealogy for folk generations to come, particularly in this particular epoch where we have global environmental injustice that is directly rooted in racial capitalism that has deleterious impact on communities of color across the world, that connects to the Pacific, that connects to the Caribbean, and that also connects to South Carolina HBCUs as well. And I also wanted to make a note. I also wanted to make a quick note, because when you say he got kicked out of at HBCU, how appropriate, right?
Yes.
Because we could go through the anyway. But let's pick back up there. What is he doing? Again, I think it's important. And again, folk, get the book. We're not going to talk about everything, but what I wanted to do with this conversation is talk about the ideas. And you can read the book to get the details of how these ideas, these grand ideas that we're discussing, that's how I wanted to approach this conversation. But talk about Kenya and how that propelled him to the work part, right? To the actual technical contributions, the material contributions, because again, he's somebody who understands intellectual work has to come with work. Right. A connection with praxis. Talk a little bit about that and move out that way.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And this is why I love the stories. So in Kenya, as I mentioned, some of the folks that he knows from California, this is 1950. When it's in California, this is 1958, right? This is 57 rather. It's that. So those students are going to be the first in the colonial, post-colonial world. These are the first, right? These are going to be the first Kenyans to get these degrees, right? This is that, at least in the memory of a Europeanized version of, expertise. It's the first for African people who are going back to build their nations.
Right.
So when he gets to Kenya,
let's pause right there, because that's a very important point. The first is an African, because it's ancient. We're really talking about ancient ideas, right?
Exactly. Right.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I had to interject real quick. Go ahead.
No, but that's important. I want to just stress that for the listening audience, that's in quotes. Okay, that's in quotes. You can't see my quotes. Yes, I'm making quotes.
We hear through the radio. We hear through the radio. We hear through the air.
So when he goes back, right, the students are now, these quote unquote first. So they have some sense of weight. So he gets a job teaching at University of East Africa, which at the time had satellite campuses also in Tanzania and Uganda. But at the time, it's University of East Africa. He also meets a core of African-American, folks who return back to Africa, just like the Ghana context, right? There's a community in Nairobi that would include people like, really critical players like Ruth Stotson-Jiri, who, is a heavyweight. She writes about education and decolonization in Kenya. African-American educator. She actually becomes director of Phelps Stokes programs years later, but she writes this phenomenal dissertation on Kenyan education. One of the things Kenya was trying to do was Africanize its civil servants, but also Africanize, and this is the language of Kenyatta's government, Africanize the education system and curriculums, including science. So one of Pauulu's work is, transforming, the public school system science curriculum into African context. So we're not just talking about European weather patterns, right? Or European animals. We're talking about African animals, African ecologies, foodways, climates. When we think about Africa, there's a lot of attention on what this looks like in terms of politics. But from a scientific perspective, what does look like? I don't think we really have a grasp of what that means. Pauulu's, one of his mentors was, if we go independent, but our energy sources are still controlled by our colonizers, are we truly free? This is not just a political conversation, an economic conversation. From an energy standpoint, right? If the energy systems are still controlled by the former colonizers, are we truly free? If the technocrats are still European, if the ones who control your generators, they run your electricity, is that still fueled through Europe? We are not free. So he saw his contribution as always being political, but his work in ecology, but is also meeting folks like Joseph E. Harris, who's going to found African diaspora studies. Harris and his family are in Kenya at this time. So Harris and Pauulu formed this amazing relationship. And this also travels through decades. Harris is someone who's always feeding Pauulu with information about the Black world and vice versa. Pauulu was talking about Black people he met through his travels. So they have this amazing connection that actually helps me at Howard. Mm-hmm. It's time I don't know, but it's going to help me years later when I'm a grad student with Harris, this beast of diaspora, who I'm actually afraid of, because this guy knows the whole world.
Yeah, Joseph Harris, right? Joseph,
exactly, Joseph
Harris. Right?
Yes, yes, Joseph E. Harris, yes.
Yeah.
So in that context, Pauulu starts doing work around building water tanks with bamboo. His first design was actually in Liberia. He refines his technique and writes his first manual on how to build water tanks from bamboo and a home from bamboo while he's in Kenya at this moment. That model, he's going to refine that and do actually a ton of projects, rural projects at the village level all across Oceania, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu in particular. Actually, when I traveled throughout Oceania, I was able to see some of these water tanks he had built. At the University of Papua New Guinea, he built this model of what he called the model Melanesian home from bamboo and also from natural resources that were available to communities in these areas. That was much of his professional work. But it's in Kenya where he has this, I mean, we sometimes we think of Africa, right? I mean, think of Africa continentally, which is important. But Kenya's in the Indian Ocean, right? We're in the Indian Ocean. We're not in the Atlantic. So when you look at the ocean, you're looking towards the Indian Ocean, you're looking towards Asia, you're looking towards the Pacific. So Pauulu becomes part of this network of activists, engineers, and this is his diaspora, a political world of Black engineers who are not just Atlantic-based, that are also Pacific-based, and the lens is also going east of Africa. So folks from Mauritius, from the Comoros Islands, Andaman Islanders, these are folks who become part of Pauulu's vocabulary. And when he talks about the Black world, he's always talking about there's a Black world in the Indian Ocean, there's a Black world in the Pacific. So when myself, I end up in places like, Kemet, studying Arabic, when I meet Comoros Islanders, I know who they are in an abstract sense, because Pauulu has already told me about these communities. And now I just want to know more. So he creates these. For me, Pauulu becomes a really important conduit for the Black Pacific. Even a Black Indian Ocean, if we might say, that I don't think I would have had the same mapping. My mapping of the Black world would have been made much more challenging if I didn't have a conduit like Pauulu, who had been a conduit for the Black world. I mean, he's literally has articles in the Black World magazine about the Black Pacific. And I know we're getting there, so I'll pause there, because maybe that's probably the next. I'll give you a chance to ask another question or comment.
No, absolutely. I mean, and you keep saying long story short, and we like the long stories, but of course we want folk to, again, to read the details, and again, the conversation that we're having is really to map, how do we map the details of ideas and how they form and develop, but also what is it that we're supposed to be taking from this? And it's something that you said. I mean, it's someone who travels to Kenya and travels to the continent. Right. When we talk about Africanized education, we have to be careful and see that there's an Africanization of colonization too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely. There. But again, when you're talking about, your point that you're making, we're talking about ancient treks. When we look at diaspora, and of course, Harris has done a lot of work, because when he's in Nairobi, he actually does this conference that is there, that kind of really sets the stages and the parameters in terms of engagement of an African diaspora in Nairobi. Pauulu's there. Right. Not only do you have these ancient connections of the world, the Indian Ocean world there, of the Pacific world there, a lot of Black people, because Black people are everywhere, and they'd be like, oh, Black people in the Pacific, of course, because there's ancient treks there, right? Right. So you have to read that history, but then to understand that what you're doing is linking that through a radical resistance through Pauulu's diaspora. And I think that is important in your term, because it's looking out towards the East, which is, again, moves there, right? So he moves there following these ancient or older treks or older migrations of African people throughout the region, but also how they move throughout the world as well. So it's so it's interesting, because it's almost like it's looking at a decolonization of a decolonization process, right? If you think about it in that particular, so he's mapping, he's moving back through time to bring forward these these ideas at the same time, interacting with it. Go ahead, jump in. So
no, it's you're absolutely correct. Because in Kenya, he's going to meet Malcolm X. This is 1964 during Malcolm's second trip. He actually met Malcolm in California as well. He meets Malcolm because Malcolm also gives a talk to this community of African Americans. And there's a core of these African American women, and their Kenyan husbands, and some of them are starting schools like the Ralph Bunton National School, which Pauulu, becomes headmaster, quote unquote, for. But it's also going back to Bermuda. This is early 1960s. And from early 1960s until late 1960s, is in Africa in some degree. So it was in Africa when the Black Power movement emerges. But it's been in Africa to see the process of decolonization. He's in Kenya before he's independent. He's able to see, right, the tough work of nation building that you're mentioning. This Africanization of colonialist ideas is a problem. And so for him, he also sees the potential, but also the pitfalls. Fanon's national consciousness, he knows what that is. So his vocabulary of Black power, which is coming, is going to also include his experience in Africa from a real perspective. It's not an abstract idea. Malcolm returns to the Americas, tells the Black Power working group of people like Chuck Stone about this Bermudian guy in Kenya doing this work. Pauulu ends up at one of the Black Power conferences in Philadelphia in 1968. It suggested there should be a Black Power conference outside of the United States. Actually, that's Paulu's suggestion. Takes place in 1969, and Bermuda, as mentioned, is invited to go to Australia. Once again, a radio host interviews Pauulu about Black Power's relevance. When a white Australian radio host interviews him about Black Power's relevance to Australia, he says, of course, if you're pressing Black folks, of course it's relative. He's invited to Australia. Now, what's striking about this is Pauulu is always thinking down the road, but not just about himself. So at the Black Power conference, he talked to James, and it's part of the meeting that, is this not time for a sixth Pan-African Congress to take place? As we know, the fifth one in Manchester, 1945. It's been several years. James is being one of those persons there. He says, James, what do you think? James says, I like it, but you need to go talk to the old man. Old man is Kwame Nkrumah, who now is in Guinea, through, the work of Sékou Touré. So Pauulu was invited to Australia, but is also trying to have a Black Power conference in Barbados as a follow-up to Bermuda's conference. That gets sabotaged. That becomes the Congress of African Peoples in Atlanta, 1970, which Pauulu is actually going to invite Black Power activists that he meets in Australia to that Congress, which is a really important moment for Black internationalism. These are cutting-edge Black Power activists in the Pacific. And the Pacific lexicon are giants, people like Patricia Corwer, Bob Mazza. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Pauulu, on his route to Australia, and for me this matters, he first travels to see the old man. He goes to Nkrumah. And then Nkrumah says, yes, okay, this sounds great. I'm on board. But you need to go talk to Nyerere. Because you probably should have this conference in Tanzania. It's probably the best place for this conference because of Nyerere's work around Pan-Africanism, and he controls the state. Like, I don't have that. And so this is important too, right? Because the way we remember when we're taught about Pan-Africanism in the classroom, it's Nkrumah here, one Africa, Pan-Africanism, there's Nyerere, federated concept. But Nkrumah is quick to say, go to Nyerere. That's the best place to have this Pan-African Congress, which is how we get to six-pack in 1974. But this process starts in 69. This takes years. And for me, this is important because, and I think it's something we talked about years ago, when we look at a conference from just the starting date of it, we miss the significance, the possibilities, the networks that are formed before and after. It's a 5-year process. Most scholars who look at six-pack, they focus on the two-week period in Tanzania. But there's a much broader lens. Long story short, there's a ton of folks going to see Nkrumah in Guinea. Ton of folks. We know Kwame Touré, and we know this is where he gets, changed his name. But Pauulu is there. Obiang Bluna, fond of, the Black Panther Party in London, also visits Nkrumah. Nkrumah will record his, message to Black people of Britain via Obiang Bluna. So once again, there's conversations between Nkrumah and Grace Lee Boggs and Shirley Green Du Bois. So for me, this is Paulu's diaspora. I'm looking for Pauulu with Nkrumah in Guinea, but what else is there? Right? So then he travels to Tanzania. He gets the okay. From Tanzania, he stops in Madagascar. He stops in Reunion. He meets with activists, inviting folks to this Black Power conference and also six-pack. And from there, he goes to Australia. So the route is via Indian Ocean. So for me, the journey that matters, right? The mapping and how he gets. By the time he's got to Australia, he's already built, he's traveled across Africa, funding by the community, right? This is not, an institution-sponsored trip.
No grants. No grants.
Or grants, no, right, that's not right. Because he can't even get a job in Bermuda because of his politics. The white state won't hire him. So he gets packages from Bermuda's Black community of funds under the table. This is how he supports stuff in Bermuda. This brother who has global, experience cannot find a job in Bermuda, which speaks to Bob Marley's piece, right? Some, good man, never honored even his own yard. Right. He gets to Australia. He works with this group, Aboriginal Advancement League. This is important for me because when we think about Australia, when we talk about Black Power, it's important that we're having these conversations, but we're looking at, when we think of Black Power globally, we're still looking for, in my opinion, Black Panther formations. So the Australian Black Panther Party is critical in Australia. There's no debate about that. But Australia is a vast space. It's not the only Black Power group. Melbourne is the major Black Power organization is the Aboriginal Advancement League, who Pauulu invites to Barbados. They end up in Atlanta in 1970. And that is a phenomenal moment for the story of Black Power globally.
No, absolutely. Because again, I mean, even if those who really take a very advanced or critical understanding of Pan-Africanism itself, and a lot of people try to look at Black internationalism, because Pan-Africanism itself is international, period. There is no debate. Right? But then this notion of a Black internationalism is very interesting as well, because a lot of times, to be honest with you, an academic, and the reason why it's important to trace, and the reason why I wanted you to really look at this, is that what we're really actually always going back to, even in an international context, as Kwame Tori would say, is Africa's always at the center of it, right? So at the center of it, the work is really looking back to constructing an Africana world, or an African world, through not only intellectual engagement and relationships, but through resistance as well. But also, how do we see a world beyond a colonial world? How do we see a world beyond a world that is rooted in a racial, capitalist, oppressive forms of knowledge that filters into our everyday life? So what I wanted to do now is to take a quick pivot, because we want to kind of pause this conversation, because this is really setting up folk for your next work, right? Not only do we trace your first piece, and also the many articles that you've written on this, because you, again, when you're going back, you're thinking about this constantly, right? So you also you've written journal articles that culminates into a book, that culminates into, ideas for this one, that is literally setting the stage for a next one. What I'm really want our listeners to understand is, what we're tracing these ideas also comes through a process of intellectual and practical engagement, right? It's not just thinking about it, but it's also really trying to understand what is the materiality of it. As Pauulu had told you, what are you going to do? Are you going to go to Africa and teach history? You know what I mean? As Pauulu told you, if your food sources are controlled, your energy sources are controlled, are you truly free? Right. So, tracing this, what you're doing, being trained, of course, you mentioned this, be clear. You was trained by Joseph as well, having interactions with him, also having the practical experience that Pauulu was able to bring everything together in the conversations, and also showing you. What I find interesting about your work, and I've always found this interesting, because even when we talked years ago, was the fact that you are very clear about resituating this notion of environmental justice into the long Black radical tradition. And what you're doing with your work is, what I see what you're doing is really highlighting the relationship that African people, or Africana people, have always had with land and with geography, in relation to constructing societies, just societies as well. Could you talk a little bit about that as we kind of wind down just this particular conversation? I know you have to go, and I have to go as well, but could you talk a little bit about how do we understand that, or how folks should be understanding, this notion of environmental justice as being automatically innate in the cultural fabric of African cosmology, or African people's understanding of themselves in relation to the universe, but also in relationship to the land, or to the earth as well?
Well, you know what I'll do is, there's a number of ways I can get at that, but I think I'll go back to Six-Pack. The Sixth Pan-African Congress of Tanzania. It's the first one held on the continent of Africa. And because of Pauulu's, I should say, his push, one of the main goals of that Congress was the question of science and technology for Africa. and they were trying to create a Pan-African society of engineers that would build a Pan-African center of science within Africa that could address the ecological concerns of the Black world. This was one of the, and there's only a few stated goals of this Congress. This is one of them. And so this is important because it raises the question at six-pack, this is 74, to asking questions about the impact of colonialism on Africa ecologically. What's the impact of slavery and desertification, the spread of the desert, right? When you take millions of people, primarily farmers, out of Africa, how does that impact the ability to grow food, to grow farms, and also halt the spreading of the desert? So these are ecological questions that six-pack is raising in 74. But Vanuatu is a really phenomenal country, and I have to integrate them into this final segment, because while Pauulu was traveling to Australia, he also ends up in Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, suggesting that folks from those communities come to six-pack. So Vanuatu sends a delegation led by a brother named Barak Sope. Vanuatu was colonized by the French and the British simultaneously. So while they're at six-pack, the Barak Sope puts on the table the broader questions of the Pacific. So he talks about Vanuatu and colonialism. He also talks about nuclear testing, which the French are doing in its colonies. He's a part of a group or a movement, the Nuclear Free Independent Pacific movement, that was suggesting that, you can't just talk about a nuclear free Pacific without talking about independence, because the French test the nuclear weapons on the Pacific because these are their colonies, but they wouldn't do it in Paris. Why not do it in Paris or France? So if we're independent, that's the way we can also be healthy and protect our waters and our lands. So Barak is talking about these things at six-pack. He described themselves as African people who left Africa 1,000 years ago. But what's interesting, and where Black internationalism has become useful for me, is looking at how Black power and Black internationalism also, for me, invokes how these islands separated by colonialism have to repair their own relationships among one another in the Pacific too. So it's going towards Africa, but the road, there's all these other stops first. Like there's this conceptual agreement that Black people populate the Pacific via Papua New Guinea. And this is before colonialism. But there are so many, colonialism does so many, it ruptures so many relationships. Some of the work is repairing inter-Pacific relationships to break across the boundaries of the European imagined boundaries of Polynesian, Melanesian, Micronesian. Black power is challenging these notions. So I mentioned the sister Patricia Corwa. While she's at the Congress of African Peoples, she wants to go home. Like the discussion of Africa going home, she wants to go home. But for her, home is also the island of Vanuatu, where thousands of Melanesian peoples were taken forcibly in a period called blackbirding and taken to sugar and cotton plantations in Australia. So she goes to Vanuatu and she's kicked out of the country. She can't return by the British colonial structure and they say she attended a conference for the emancipation of the Black race. And she knows this guy, Pauulu. We can't let her back into this country. Pauulu ends up in Vanuatu, invited there by Barak Sope's party, and is doing village and community work. Reminding communities of a moment of sustainability. In other words, how to make oil from coconuts for yourselves and not for Australian British companies. Making shoes from leather. His bamboo work. And the British government and French government see him as a threat. This is 1975. And they suggest bringing in troops to take him out of the country. And they expected a resistance movement of some 200 villages. So the point was, we need enough soldiers to fight a resistance movement of villages. And maybe we need to bring in troops from Fiji, from Britain. They have all these extensive conversations. He's arrested. I was able to get to those communities that he worked with. And it was a challenge to even get to these spaces from a physical standpoint. And they weren't armed. They one rifle for hunting, maybe. They remember Pauulu, very favorably. They remember the ecological work. They still didn't know why he was actually, the police showed up in a seaplane, took him from this community and left. They take him to this main airport. And Pauulu told us stories about how he was kicked out of this country and, you know, how villagers drove their cars in front of the planes. And when he first told me this story in the 90s, you know, I wasn't ready to believe him. I mean, I believed him, but I wasn't ready to believe him. You know, I didn't think he was lying, but I wasn't ready to conceptually believe him, to ask important questions, like which country, you know, what year, how, who. But then I get to the British Archives and there's a story, right? There's a story of, you know, the party finds out that it's been taken from this village. They call this young activist Metis Kele Kele, Kalkat Metis Kele Kele. And I'm abbreviating his name. Kalkat Metis Kele Kele is an abbreviation of this brother's name. But he was the young, you know, organizer. He hadn't even met Pauulu. He said, oh, they're taking the brother working with the sugar cane? Calls his folks up. They drive to the airport, drive the cars in front of the plane. They jump out, they're shouting Black Power at the pilot. The French and British send in troops. I find pictures of the plane in magazines. I find stories of this. Clashes break out at night. Folks are arrested. Pauulu's put in his plane, sent to California, where he evades the agent that takes him there, gets a new passport. He's back in Fiji within months with the support of folks like Jeff Donaldson of the Black Arts Movement from Chicago. They raised funds to send him back. Folks like Jeff Donaldson, C.L.R. James, LaRon Bennett, Mary Evans, Gwendolyn Brooks, Elizabeth Catlett. And I'm saying, wow, Elizabeth Catlett was in Mexico at the time. So from Mexico City, Catlett is sending funds to send a brother from Bermuda back to Oceania to fight in an anti-colonial struggle against British and French. But we will never say these names in the Pan-African pantheon. I mean, what could be more Pan-African than that? Catlett is in Mexico, crying out loud, sending funds to Chicago, send the brother back to the Pacific. Long story short, once again, I meet activists who were at the airport that day, and they proudly showed me the tickets, the fines they got from the police, and said, we never paid these tickets. We didn't pay these tickets. Like, that brother was helping us do political education and ecological work. And but that also points to why, from the standpoint of the state, why that's a threat. They found that work that he was doing in sustainable development to be a threat. Now, when I would return to Oceania years later, it made so much sense to me to see folks using solar power, you know, having answers or trying to work through issues of, you know, climate change where the sea levels are rising, but not waiting for the West to fix things per se. And these are conversations and movements like the, you know, Association of Small Island States that Pauulu was a part of in the 1970s, 80s, with these small islands across the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, Pacific, are building a Black world that's trying to address climate change. That when we think of, you know, or the scholarship of environmental justice invisibilizes all these Black movements. And the work in the groups like the UN, UNESCO. Pauulu makes the Pan-African movement an actual NGO within United Nations. That's a whole nother story. It's a whole nother story.
Yeah, brother, there was like 7 things you just said that we could probably spend, you know, the rest of the day or the rest of the week to talk about. That was a great way, you know, to really kind of encapsulate, you know, what we were trying to do with today with this conversation, and also pointing people to the catalog of your scholarship, because again, it's very important, you know, to look at the genealogy, to look at, you know, the ideas that they're developing, because it's one, you know, we share this affinity with how these ideas are developing in the particular space, but also how they communicate across time and space. And I think that is important. And also, when we're talking about Africa, we're talking about not Africa as only a geography, but also as its, you know, its ideas, as the ideas developed, and also how they become evolved in the diaspora itself. And this is one of an articulation of the true essence of an articulation of what Black power is, right? So that notion of Black power was even there before it was articulated, in Mississippi, right? This idea, was there. And you mentioned Mexico, Black radicalism in Mexico. I mean, we could go on and on about that, which again is something.
Right.
I'm sure that there's work. I came across a few pieces, but really looking at, and also we can understand why Mexico itself not only has a historical relationship, antagonistic relationship with the settler colony of the United States itself, but also its deep-rooted, the deep-rooted hate of a white majority or a white power elite here, how they hate Mexico as well, right? Because we can go to Castro, we could go to we could go to CLR James, we could go to Pauulu, we could go, all of this, But again, I wanted to give you this opportunity because I mentioned how I see your work, right? And I think it's very important, because most people talk about what they getting out your work, and I'm sure we always, as when we write, we always are interested in how people think about our work, because sometimes we set out with one particular idea, and and folks. So how do you see your work? Because again, you've been given ancestral marching orders through your relationship with Pauulu, right? And now you are literally formulating that and trying to live up to that. How do you see your work? How do you, because again, people always tell you what they see about your work, but how do you see it? How do you see what you're doing and where you're headed?
Man, James, once again, that's a great that's a great comment and question. Wow. The ancestral marching orders. So I'll say it with another question. So what happens to someone interested in, transformative change for Black folks, right? Who spent most of his time, or her time, trying to understand the struggles of African people and ancestral notions and ancestral voices and movements of Latin America and the Caribbean. And then you find yourself in the midst of a whole nother set of ancestors in Oceania. And they show up, right? They show up. And they show up and they say, hey, wait a minute. You're not done. You just can't say, this dude came here. Who did he meet? Like, hold up, homeboy. Hold up. Like, you weren't ready for this conversation a couple of years ago. But now you finished the Pauulu book, you need to talk about Kaf Walker. Like, you're gonna, or more important, how I experience it. Kaf Walker says, brother, you need to talk about me. I know Pauulu was about it, but I'm telling you right now, if you don't talk about me and my work, Kaf Walker is an amazing, poet, activist, Aboriginal Australian, who's a part of this broad network of Black writers across Oceania. She's in Papua New Guinea, she's in Fiji, she travels to the United States. None of that's in the Pauulu book, none. Her son, which is striking, founds the Black Panther Party of Australia. And that would probably be enough, right? But so that's not even, we're not even there yet. Kaf Walker is on the delegation, the Aboriginal and Papua New Guinea delegation that goes to Festac, Nigeria in 1977. So she has a story to tell. And there's more. There's people like Leo Hannett, who formed the New Guinea Black Power Group at the University of Papua New Guinea in 1970. Pauulu is working with these students because it's in Papua New Guinea, and this is where he spends most of his time. Pauulu is, there's all these other folks who show up in the room, and not only do they show up, but they also give you a way. They show you a way to tell the stories. And so that gives birth to the next project. And I won't say the next book, the next project, right? Because the book, to your point about the strategy, yes, the book's a part of a broader project. For me, on a very personal level, Paulu's Diaspora is how I became a writer. I wrote Black Power in Bermuda, but I wasn't a writer. I wrote a book. But on a personal level, I became a writer in Pauulu's diaspora. I found a voice. And I say a voice because we don't just have one voice. You know, people always say, the writer, you got to find your voice. Well, I found a grip of voices. I'm trying to figure out which voice to use at which time. That's what a writer is. It's trying to figure out what voice to use and what time. My own methodologies, which I call my enunciism. And in other words, in Pauulu's diaspora, what I'm also doing, I'm also leaving clues to myself about where I was when I wrote what I wrote, that the readers may not understand or get, but they'll get what they're supposed to get. But there's a mapping for myself. So the chapter titles mean things, right? There's the vocabularies I use that simultaneously I'm speaking to a very local Bermuda audience, a broader Caribbean audience, and a broader Black world audience, sometimes at the very same time. But that was part of me working on the craft. So for me, the personal part of it was all these things combining, you know, as the book is full of, I use surveillance records, right? The book is also how Black power was surveilled across the world by the British, the French, Canada, you know, across the Caribbean, Africa, and Oceania. That's what the book is also about. But it's also about these personal narratives and the stories of revolutionaries and artists. So how do I combine these sources to tell a story in a way that I think is readable? That process is what this book meant to me as well. So there's a lot, and I appreciate the question. There's a lot there, and the next project it has its own different set of vocabularies, aims, but now I know what I want to do with my work. I mean, I know what I knew what I was doing all the while. I want to take risks with my work. I want to write work that helps transform the Black world, to wake us up. I'm trying to you know, do my best to get close to Gerald Horne, but I gave up that mission. Never gonna happen.
Right there.
You know, but Horne is the standard that you can't obtain, but it's never gonna happen. But I'm trying to, but I'm already knowing it's not gonna happen. It's like I'm racing Usain Bolt, but I gotta race, right? You're in the race,
right.
But I'm not gonna catch the guy, but I gotta do my best because I'm in the race. But it's not because I actually think I gotta run.
Yeah.
You know, people are watching.
Yeah.
You gotta keep running, but it's not because you think. So anyway, my point is, you know, there are all these, and I'm also still trying to speak to my community of Bermuda at the same time. So for me, you know, in a nutshell, yeah, I think that's what, in some ways, what this book is meant for me. I can now do the other work I need to be doing.
No, brother, and that's powerful, right? That's powerful because what you're doing is situating yourself in this longer genealogy, but knowing that you belong in this genealogy and you know you have a responsibility to it, right? Which is something that a lot of folk don't get a chance to do. They write books,
right?
They write articles,
right?
So and it's something else that, you know, again, you're really expanding these notions and components and what I would call properly situating them. Because one of the things that that we attempt to do with these platforms is really, you know, help us remember the things that were already there. And a little side note or a little nugget that you dropped in the context of that is this COINTELPRO was international. A lot of people look at COINTELPRO as rooted in the United States, but it was an international project. That has culminated into AFRICOM, that has culminated into these relationships, intel relationships or militaristic relationships that have culminated in bases across the world, which is another conversation, right? Again, thank you for taking the time to talk today, brother. Again, we'll try not to make this be, all these long time, but again, when we get caught up into the things that we're doing, we can rest assured that us not having conversation in between those spaces, when we do, we're literally understanding that we're doing, justice to our trying to fit into a tradition, or trying to answer the calls that are set by the ancestors in our own spaces, but also get together to share notes, which more often, so again, thank you for taking the time to join us today. We look forward to your next work. Again, I'll be in touch on some other things as we move forward. Yeah, brother. I mean, great conversation, man. Great conversation.
James, I just want to say thanks to you, thanks to the listening audience. It's been a really humbling experience. Times felt like I was lost at sea. That's slightly dramatic, but not really. But I feel like if we were to map our conversations, right, it's a long because and I mean on a personal level, myself, yourself, the audience, Moiza, we've been having these conversations for years, and I think if we actually listen, put them next to each other, that to me would be a really interesting project. So I want to thank you for give myself a space to work through some of these thoughts, and you to work, the audience from WPFW. It's been part of the story and the narrative, and this DC's community, scholars and activists, gave these these thoughts a place to marinate. Without that, they may not have manifested in the way that they did. So thank you.
No, again, and this is something that I call thinking Black out loud, these particular spaces that we do. Again, thank you for taking the time to join us today, Dr. Swan.
Peace.
Peace. That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Moiza Mutali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funda Ngunda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior researcher and content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.